Imagine a machine so massive it shakes the earth beneath your feet. A fire-breathing iron beast weighing over 1 million pounds, thundering through frozen battlefields, hauling tanks, ammunition, and entire armies across continents at war. These weren't ordinary trains, they were weapons of logistics built to crush distance, defy destruction, and keep empires alive. From Hitler's Eastern Front nightmares to America's mountain-conquering giants, these are the 10 most brutal and powerful war locomotives ever built. Number 10. The DRB Britain, World War I. Let's start our journey with the grandfather of war locomotives, the Railway Operating Division 280, known simply as the ROD. When World War I erupted in 1914, nobody anticipated just how important railways would become. The Western Front stretched across hundreds of miles of mud, trenches, and devastation, and the only reliable way to move supplies, troops, and artillery to the front lines was by rail. Britain's Railway Operating Division needed a locomotive that could handle the battered, muddy rail lines of France and Belgium. They chose the Great Central Railway's 8K Class, a 280 heavy freight design originally created by John G. Robinson for hauling coal trains across the English Midlands. Over 520 of these locomotives were built during the war. They were rugged, simple, and incredibly reliable. They could run on poorly maintained track, burn low-quality coal, and keep moving when more delicate machines would have ground to a halt. After the war, many were sold off to British Railways at bargain prices, and they continued serving for decades. The ROD 280 proved one thing beyond doubt, that locomotives could win wars just as surely as guns and tanks. Number 9. The JNR Class D51, Digoichi, Japan, World War II. Moving to the Pacific, we find one of the most legendary locomotives in Asian history, the Japanese Class D51, affectionately known as the Dagoichi, designed by the brilliant engineer Hideo Shima, the same man who would later create Japan's revolutionary Shinkansen bullet train. The D51 was a 282 Mikado-type locomotive, first produced in 1936. It was designed as a modernized version of the older D50 class, with a focus on fuel efficiency and versatility. A total of 1,115 D51s were built for domestic use alone, making it the most numerous locomotive class in Japanese history. During the war, these machines became the backbone of Japan's military logistics, hauling weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies across the Japanese home islands to feed the Imperial Army's war machine. As the war dragged on and steel became scarce, wartime production got creative and desperate. Builders began substituting wood for steel in parts like running boards, smoke deflectors, cab structures, and even coal bunkers on the tender. These wooden component locomotives were fragile, but they kept the supply lines moving when Japan needed them most. When Japan lost Sakhalin Island to the Soviet Union at the end of the war, 30 D51s were left behind and captured by Russian forces. The Soviets put them right back to work on Sakhalin's narrow-gauge railways, where some continued running until 1979. Today, 173 D51s survive in preservation across Japan, with 2 D51-200 and D51-498 still in operational condition, reminders of an era when steam power fueled an empire at war. Number 8. The WD Austerity 280, Britain, World War II. When Britain entered World War II, it quickly became clear that the country needed a new class of freight locomotive, one that could be built quickly, cheaply, and in huge numbers. Enter the War Department Austerity 280, designed by Robert A. Riddles. Riddles had worked on the design team for the famous LMS Stanier 8F, and he brought that experience to bear on a locomotive that was stripped down to the bare essentials. No fancy fittings, no unnecessary luxuries, just raw hauling power. A total of 935 WD Austerity 280s were built from 1943 onwards, making it one of the most produced classes of British steam locomotive ever. These machines generated a tractive effort of 34,215 pounds-force with a boiler pressure of 225 psi. They weighed about 70 tons and were fitted with Walschaerts valve gear and two outside cylinders measuring 19 inches by 28 inches. After the D-Day landings in June 1944, hundreds of these locomotives were shipped across the English Channel to operate on the war-torn railways of liberated Europe. They hauled everything the advancing Allied armies needed: fuel, food, ammunition, tanks, and troops. After the war ended, 733 of them were absorbed into British railways and served well into the 1960s. Others were sold to railways in the Netherlands, Sweden, and even Hong Kong. Only one WD Austerity 280 survives today, a testament to how hard these machines were worked during and after the war. Number 7. The DRB Class 42 Kriegslokomotive, Germany, World War II. While the Class 52 gets most of the fame, Germany produced another brutal war locomotive that deserves serious attention: the DRB Class 42. Built from 1943 onwards, the Class 42 was essentially a simplified wartime version of the powerful pre-war DRB Class 44 three-cylinder locomotive. Where the Class 52 was designed for lighter, more damaged track with a low axle load, the Class 42 was built for routes that could handle heavier loads. These were the heavy hitters, designed to move the biggest, heaviest military freight trains where the infrastructure could support them. The Class 42 was classified as Kriegslokomotive KDL3. A total of 859 units were built during and shortly after the war. They featured a 210-0 wheel arrangement, two outside cylinders producing around 2,200 horsepower, and a maximum speed of 80 kilometers per hour. 70 of these locomotives were captured by the Soviet Union at the end of the war and given the Russian classification TL. Others ended up in Poland, where Polish factories built 126 additional units, designated as Class Ti 43. Another 76 were built in Vienna and sold to railways in Luxembourg, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The original German plan was to build these locomotives in truly enormous numbers, but the collapse of the Third Reich put an end to that ambition. Still, the Class 42 remains one of the most formidable heavy freight war locomotives ever produced. Number 6. The Russian Locomotive Class Yeda. Russia, USA, World War I and II. Here is a locomotive with a truly extraordinary story, the Russian Class Ye, also known as the Decapod. These 210-0 heavy freight locomotives were designed for the Imperial Russian Railways, but built in the United States by American manufacturers. The original order came during World War I, when Russia desperately needed locomotives to keep its vast railway network running during the conflict. American factories, including Baldwin, Alco, and others, produced these rugged machines with a tractive effort of about 51,500 pounds force. They were built for Russia's broad 5-foot gauge, with relatively low axle loads to handle the often inferior Russian track. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and suddenly around 200 of these locomotives were stranded in the United States with nowhere to go. American railways fitted them with wider tires to adapt them for standard gauge use, and they served on domestic American lines until Russia could accept delivery. When World War II erupted, the design was revived. New batches of updated Ye-class variants were shipped to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program to help the Soviets fight the German invasion. These machines hauled critical military supplies across the vast distances of the Soviet Union, from factories in the Urals to the front lines hundreds of miles to the west. Remarkably, 39 of these locomotives survive in preservation today, scattered across Russia and other countries. They stand as monuments to one of history's most remarkable examples of wartime industrial cooperation. Number 5. The WD Austerity 210-0, Britain, World War II. The bigger, meaner sibling of the 280 we covered earlier, the WD Austerity 210-0 was Britain's answer to the need for even more versatile war locomotives. Also designed by Robert Riddles, the 210-0 was based on the same principles as the 280, but added an extra pair of driving wheels. This gave it the same power output, a tractive effort of 34,215 pounds force, but with a significantly lighter axle load of just 13.7 tons. That lighter footprint meant these locomotives could operate on secondary lines and hastily repaired wartime track that would have buckled under heavier machines. A total of 150 of these locomotives were built by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow between 1943 and 1945. They were the first 210 locomotives to ever operate in Great Britain and the first major class of 10 coupled engines in the country. One clever design feature was the flangeless center pair of driving wheels, which allowed the long locomotive to negotiate tighter curves without derailing. Absolutely essential on the damaged makeshift railways of wartime Europe. After D-Day, most of these locomotives were shipped to France to support the Allied advance toward Germany and the Siegfried Line. After the war, the majority were sold to the Netherlands, where they formed the NS 5000 class. One famous survivor, number 600, named Gordon, became the last steam locomotive owned by the British Army. Number 4. The Soviet FD Class, Soviet Union, World War II. Now we enter the realm of true Soviet industrial might. The FD Class locomotive, named after Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet secret police, first built in 1931 at the October Revolution Locomotive Factory in Luhansk, Ukraine. The FD was a massive 210-2 freight locomotive heavily influenced by American designs from builders like Alco and Baldwin. With 10 driving wheels, a boiler pressure of 213 psi, and a power output of 3,100 horsepower, the FD was one of the most powerful freight locomotives in the entire Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. A total of 3,213 FD locomotives were built between 1931 and 1942, 2,927 of the FD-20 variant, and 286 of the FD-21, which differed primarily in its superheater design. These machines weighed a combined 259.5 tons with their tenders and could reach speeds of 85 kilometers per hour. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the FD class became absolutely critical to the war effort. These locomotives hauled military supplies, weapons, food, and troops across 23 of the Soviet Union's 43 railways, including the vital routes through Siberia and the Urals, where Soviet factories had been relocated to escape the German advance. Production was interrupted during the darkest days of the war. In 1942, the Luhansk factory was evacuated, and only 4 locomotives were built that year at a backup facility in Ulan-Ude, far to the east near Mongolia. But the FDs already in service kept the Soviet war machine moving through the most desperate hours of the conflict. After the war, FD locomotives continued serving until the early 1990s. Some were even exported to China and North Korea, where they hauled freight for decades more. Number 3. The USATC S160 class, United States World War II. If there was a single locomotive that liberated Europe, it might just be the USATC S160. Designed by Major J.W. Marsh of the United States Army Transportation Corps, the S160 was a 280 consolidation type built specifically to fit the restricted loading gauge of European railways with their narrower bridges, tighter tunnels, and smaller clearances compared to American lines. A staggering 2,120 S160 locomotives were built between 1942 and 1945 by 3 of America's greatest locomotive builders, Baldwin, Alco, and Lima. These machines were designed for rapid, efficient mass production. They featured a boiler pressure of 225 psi, a tractive effort of 31,490 pounds force, and weighed about 72 tons. The first batches were shipped across the Atlantic and stored at the Great Western Railway's depot at Ebw Junction in Wales. About 400 were immediately put to work on British railways, the GWR, LNER, LMS, and Southern, to increase capacity in the massive build-up to D-Day. The British gave them the nickname Rattlesnake because of the distinctive clattering sound of their rod bearings. After the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the S-160s followed the advancing armies into France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually into Germany itself. They rebuilt the shattered railway networks of Europe, hauling everything from tanks to humanitarian aid. After the war, these locomotives were distributed across the globe. They served on railways in Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland, the Soviet Union, Spain, Turkey, Yugoslavia, and even countries in North Africa and Asia. 33 are known to survive in preservation today. The S160 didn't just support the war, it helped rebuild the world afterward. Number 2. The DRB Class 52 Kriegslokomotive, Germany, World War II. This is it, the most mass-produced war locomotive in history, and one of the most famous steam locomotives ever built. The German Class 52 Kriegslokomotive. Designed by Richard Wagner, chief engineer at the Locomotive Standards Bureau of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the Class 52 was born out of pure desperation. By 1941, Germany's railway network was stretched to breaking point. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had extended German supply lines thousands of miles to the east, across territory with poor, damaged, and often destroyed railways. Germany needed a locomotive that was simple, cheap, fast to build, and tough enough to operate on poor-quality track in extreme conditions. The result was the Class 52, a brutally simplified version of the reliable pre-war Class 50. Approximately 6,000 individual parts were changed or eliminated compared to the original design. Smoke deflectors were removed, luxuries were stripped. The design life was set at just 5 years. These were meant to win a war, not last a lifetime. The first Class 52, numbered 52.001, rolled out of the Borsig factory on September 12, 1942. Production quickly ramped up to an astonishing scale. German locomotive factories were organized into the Association of Greater German Locomotive Manufacturers, and on July 7, 1943, a propaganda parade at the Sedan marshalling yard saw 51 brand-new war locomotives, an entire day's production from all German factories set in motion simultaneously for the press. Over 7,794 Class 52 locomotives were built across factories throughout Germany and occupied Europe. They had a 210-0 wheel arrangement, a low axle load of just 15 tons, a maximum speed of 80 kilometers per hour, and could haul 1,200 tons at 65 kilometers per hour on flat track. Despite being designed for just 5 years of service, the Class 52 proved remarkably durable. Western European countries replaced them as soon as possible, but in Eastern Europe, they became workhorses for decades. Austria used them until 1976. Poland ran them into the 1990s, and incredibly, some in Bosnia were still in industrial service as recently as the late 2010s, more than 70 years after they were built as disposable war machines. 20 Class 52s are preserved in Germany today, and many more survive across Europe. The Kriegslokomotive remains the ultimate symbol of total war applied to railway engineering. Number 1. The Union Pacific Big Boy 4884, United States, World War II, and now the king of all war-era locomotives, the legendary Union Pacific Big Boy. The Big Boy wasn't designed as a military weapon. It was designed to haul heavy freight trains over the steep grades of the Wasatch Mountains between Ogden, Utah and Green River, Wyoming. But its timing made it one of the most important locomotives of World War II. And its sheer size and power make it the most awe-inspiring steam locomotive ever built. The story begins in 1940, when Union Pacific President William Jeffers ordered his engineering team, led by Otto Jabelman, to design a locomotive capable of pulling 3,300-ton freight trains over the Wasatch Range without needing a second engine. The result was a 4884 articulated locomotive of truly monstrous proportions. The numbers speak for themselves. The Big Boy measured 132 feet and 9 inches long, including its tender. It stood 16 feet tall. Fully loaded with water and coal, it weighed approximately 1.2 million pounds. That is over 540 tons. It had 4 cylinders, each measuring 23.75 by 32 inches, a boiler pressure of 300 psi, and produced a starting tractive effort of 135,375 pounds force. It could haul trains of nearly 4,000 tons at speeds up to 80 miles per hour. The first 20 Big Boys, numbered 4000 through 4019, were delivered between August and December 1941. The story goes that the name Big Boy came from an unidentified Alco worker who scrawled it on the smokebox door of locomotive number 4000, along with a V for victory, and the name stuck forever. Just months after the first delivery, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was at war. Suddenly, the nation's railroads became the backbone of the entire war effort. There were no interstate highways yet, no fleet of cargo aircraft. Everything, tanks, aircraft components, ammunition, steel, coal, fuel, food, and millions of servicemen moved by rail. The Big Boys proved so easy to operate that even inexperienced firemen could handle them, which was critical because many experienced railroad workers had gone off to fight. When Union Pacific needed more hauling capacity, they requested permission from the U.S. War Production Board to buy diesel-electric locomotives. The request was denied. The resources couldn't be spared. Instead, the government approved raw materials for 5 additional Big Boy steam locomotives. These Class II units, numbered 4020 through 4024, were delivered in 1944 with wartime modifications including heavier steel and enlarged 25,000-gallon tenders. Throughout the war, Big Boys hauled military equipment, tanks, aircraft parts, ammunition, fuel, steel, and every other critical supply across the American West. They were the heavy lifters of the American industrial war machine. Of the 25 Big Boys built, 8 survive in preservation today. And in May 2019, after a 3-year restoration, Union Pacific brought Big Boy number 4014 back to life. It is now the only operating Big Boy in the world, and as of June 2026, it continues to make excursion runs, thrilling crowds wherever it goes. When you see Big Boy 4014 thundering down the track today, you're not just watching a giant steam locomotive, you're watching a machine that helped move the materials, the equipment, and the supplies that helped win the Second World War. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us which war locomotive impressed you the most. We'll see you in the next one.